The bowl hadn't moved. That was the first thing Riven Cade clocked when he stepped through the iron door. Not the chains, not the bruises wrapped around both ankles like dark bracelets. Not even the smell of cold concrete and rust that hit the back of his throat every time he walked this corridor. The bowl. Full. Untouched. Sitting loose in the Omega's hands like it weighed nothing and meant even less. Riven stood at the bars longer than he needed to. His brothers were already gone. Zion had walked out first, Caius right behind him, both of them satisfied, both of them done. The decision had been clean and final the way their decisions always were. Keep him alive, Zion had said. No witnesses, Caius had added. And that was that. 30 seconds. A locked door. A situation handled. Except Riven hadn't moved. He was still standing there, watching this Omega sit on a floor cold enough to pull heat straight out of a body. Hi viewers, if you were Riven standing right there, looking at someone who wasn't afraid of you at all, what would that make you feel? Power expects resistance. That's the deal. That's how the whole structure works. You show force, the other person reacts, and that reaction tells you exactly where you stand. Fear is a mirror. It reflects back how much control you actually have. But this Omega wasn't reflecting anything. He was just sitting there, holding a full bowl of food he hadn't touched, staring at some fixed point on the floor like the three most dangerous men in the city were nothing more than whether passing through a room he'd already decided to wait out. Riven pushed the cell door open and stepped inside. The guard posted at the far end of the hall straightened. Sir, why isn't he eating? The guard hesitated. That hesitation was its own answer, but Riven waited anyway. He doesn't speak, sir. I didn't ask if he speaks. I asked why he isn't eating. Another pause. Longer this time. He physically can't speak. It's not refusal. The medic checked him when he came in. Something's wrong with his voice. Has been for a while. Riven looked at the Omega again. Still hadn't moved. Still hadn't looked up. The room felt suddenly smaller, and Riven couldn't explain why. He'd stood in interrogation rooms for a decade. He'd watched people break in this exact cell. He knew what fear smelled like, knew what it looked like when someone was holding themselves together by their fingernails and trying not to show it. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Riven crouched down, slow, until he was closer to eye level with the figure on the floor. Look at me, he said, quiet. Not an order, closer to a question. Nothing. Then, the Omega looked up, and the air in Riven's chest did something it had no business doing. Because those eyes didn't carry fear. They carried distance. Calm, deliberate, measuring distance, the kind a person builds after years of watching the world from somewhere unreachable. Riven's jaw tightened. He stood back up slowly, turned, and walked out of the cell without another word. The door locked behind him with a sound he barely registered. He made it 3 steps down the hallway before he stopped. Something about those eyes didn't sit right. Not the calm. Not the silence. Something else. Something that landed in the back of his mind like a word he'd heard before in a language he couldn't quite place. He'd seen that face before. He didn't know where, but he was sure of it. The second visit happened 2 days later. Riven told himself it was routine. A check. Part of the process. You keep someone alive, you verify they're still alive, you move on. He stayed 40 minutes. The third visit was the next morning. He didn't have a reason for that one. The Omega was in the same position, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him, the new bowl on the floor to his left this time. This one was half empty. Progress, technically. Riven stood at the bars and watched him trace something on the floor with his finger. Not writing. Not a pattern anyone would recognize. Just slow, deliberate movement. A loop. Corner. Another loop. Like his hand needed somewhere to go while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He stopped the moment he realized Riven was there. Didn't panic. Didn't pull his hand back fast like he'd been caught. Just stopped and went still and waited. Riven walked in. He told himself he was looking for signs of injury, checking for issues the guard might have missed. That was the story he used inside his own head, and it lasted about 4 minutes before he stopped pretending to inspect anything and just stood in the corner watching the Omega breathe. There was something off about the way he flinched. That was what started it. One of the block guards came in to swap the water jug, knocked it against the iron shelf on the way in. Loud, sudden, metallic, and the Omega's shoulders pulled inward fast. Not toward Riven. Away from the sound. Not the movement. Not the presence. The sound. Raised voices did it too. Riven tested it quietly over the next 3 visits, not cruelly, just observing. When 2 guards argued at the end of the hall, the Omega's fingers went still. When the block went quiet, his shoulders dropped. When someone shouted 2 cells over, his jaw tightened for exactly 3 seconds before he controlled it back down. He was afraid of sound. Not people. Not force. Sound. That was specific. That was learned. That was the kind of fear that came from somewhere particular. A place, a time, something that had trained his body to respond to noise the way other people respond to a raised hand. Riven filed that away and said nothing about it to anyone. The visits became every day. He stopped calling them inspections. He didn't call them anything. He just went. And the thing that happened on the 6th visit, that was the thing he kept coming back to. He'd been standing at the back wall, saying nothing, watching the Omega trace those slow patterns on the floor again. The light in that block was poor, always had been, but it caught the side of the Omega's face at a specific angle that afternoon, and Riven was looking when it happened, when the Omega slowly turned his head, made full eye contact, and held it. Not a glance. Not a quick check to see if the threat was still there. A full, deliberate, unhurried look. Like he was reading something. Like Riven was the one being studied. Riven didn't move. Didn't speak. Stood there and let it happen and felt something uncomfortable settle into his chest. Not anger, not unease exactly. Recognition. Except from where? He walked out of that cell with more questions than he'd walked in with. And for a man who built his entire life on having answers before everyone else, that was not a feeling he knew how to sit with. He came back the next morning. The storm came in fast. By nightfall, it was shaking the ventilation shafts above the cell block. Low, rolling pressure that made the lights in the corridor flicker every few minutes. The backup generators were old. Everyone in the building knew it. When the power went the 3rd time and held off for a full 30 seconds, 2 guards stepped away from the block to check the breaker panel at the far end of the hall. Riven was already walking toward the cell. He couldn't explain it later. He didn't try. The door was unlocked. Hadn't been resecured after the last check. He pushed it open and stepped in, and the lights flickered again, and in that half-dark the Omega looked up before Riven even got close. Not startled. Ready. Like he'd heard the footsteps and already decided how he was going to receive whoever came through that door. Riven stopped a few feet in. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then the light steadied, and Riven got a clear look at the Omega's face, and something in his expression had shifted. Not open, not warm, but present in a way it hadn't been in the first few visits. Like a door that had been closed was now just unlocked. "You've seen me before," Riven said. He didn't plan it. Came out low, more to himself than anyone else. But the Omega heard it. His fingers tightened around the bowl in his lap. Slow, deliberate, and his eyes stayed level. Then, after a pause that lasted long enough for Riven to think he'd imagined the whole thing, he nodded. One slow, certain nod. Riven's pulse moved differently. This was the part that didn't make sense. The part that had been sitting wrong in the back of his mind since the first day. A person who had never crossed paths with the Cade triplets didn't end up in their private holding block by accident. And a person who had crossed paths with them didn't usually survive long enough to be locked up. They ended up in the river. They ended up as a name that stopped being said out loud. This Omega was neither. He was here. He was calm. He had seen Riven before, and the look on his face right now wasn't the look of someone terrified that they'd been recognized. It was something older than that. Riven crouched down slowly, the way he'd done that first night. Eye level, close enough to see clearly, far enough to not crowd. "Where?" he asked. Just that one word. The Omega didn't answer, he couldn't, and Riven knew that. But he also didn't look confused. Didn't look lost or sorry or like he was searching for a way to explain something he couldn't put into words. He held Riven's gaze and said nothing. And in the silence, his fingers slowly released the bowl. Set it down on the floor to the side. Very carefully, like he was freeing up his hands for something. But then nothing came. He just sat there, hands loose in his lap, watching Riven with that same unbothered, patient look. And the lights flickered again, and when they came back, Riven caught a detail he hadn't noticed before. On the inside of the Omega's left wrist, older skin, layered with faint scar tissue, there was a mark. Not a wound, not an injury, a marking. He only caught the edge of it before the dim light shifted again, and the angle was gone, and the Omega's sleeve had fallen back into place. Riven stood, said nothing, walked out. He made it to the corridor before he stopped, one hand pressed flat against the cold wall, and just stood there while the storm pressed down on the building above him. He'd seen that mark before. He just didn't know how yet. He pulled the file the next morning. Not officially. Not through the system. He knew better than to leave a request trail on something he didn't want Zion or Caius asking about. He went through Mackay, a records handler who had been on their payroll for 6 years, and knew that loyalty meant forgetting what he'd seen before the hour was out. Everything on the Omega brought in from the Callaway estate perimeter. All of it. Mackay came back in 40 minutes with a folder that was lighter than it should have been. Much lighter. Riven sat with it in the back office of the third-floor compound and read every page twice. Then he set it down and stared at the wall. No criminal record. Not a sealed one. Not a scrubbed one. An absent one. This Omega had no documented contact with any syndicate family. No known associations, no flagged movements, no previous detentions. Nothing. The kind of file that only looked that clean when it was either completely genuine or very carefully constructed to look that way. The arrest documentation listed him as a trespasser caught on the estate perimeter at 11:42 p.m. Suspicious behavior. Loitering with apparent surveillance intent. The words were right. The structure was right. But the evidence attached to the report was thin. 2 photographs, a timestamp, and a security notation from a guard whose name Riven didn't recognize. He'd been on the estate security team for less than 2 weeks. Riven went back through the intake forms. The Omega's physical condition at arrival, that was in there. Bruised ankles. Lacerations along the right forearm. Mild dehydration. The medic had noted all of it, filed it, moved on. Bruised ankles from restraint. Not from running. Not from struggling. The bruising pattern was wrong for someone who'd been chased down and tackled. That was the kind of detail that disappeared if no one was looking for it. Riven flipped to the back of the folder. There was a divider. A thin cardstock separator that he almost missed because it was the same gray as the folder itself. Behind it, a single sheet of paper. Half a page of text. And then a stamp across the bottom of it in red ink. Sealed. Bloodline case. Restricted access. The rest of the page was redacted. Black bars across every line of text below the header. Riven sat with that page for a long time. Bloodline case. That phrase had a specific meaning inside their world. It didn't mean gang affiliation or family debt. It meant something older. Disputed lineage, suppressed inheritance. Someone who existed in a way that threatened a family's claim to something it had already decided belonged to it. He turned the page over. On the back, handwritten in pencil, small, hurried, like someone had done it quickly and in low light, Devereaux, child. Reported missing, connected, and then a partial case number that matched nothing in any file Riven had ever seen. He closed the folder, set it flat on the table, stared at it. The name Devereaux was not one he'd heard in years. Not because it was unfamiliar, because it had been made unfamiliar. Deliberately, by people with the resources to make a name stop existing in conversations. His brothers knew that name. He was sure of it, and they had never told him why. He started bringing food himself. He didn't announce it, didn't explain it, didn't make it a thing. He just started stopping by the kitchen on the way to the block and picking up whatever was warm. Nothing elaborate. Covered plate. A cup of something hot. Small enough that no one thought to mention it. The first time he set the plate down inside the cell, the Omega looked at it for a long moment before looking at Riven. Then he looked back at the plate. Then he picked it up and ate. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone who had learned a long time ago not to rush through anything, because rushing created noise and noise created problems. Riven sat on the floor across from him. He didn't think about how that looked. He stopped caring how things looked in this cell around the fourth day, when he realized the Omega never judged anything that happened in here. Never reacted with surprise, never responded with the kind of loaded silence that meant something was being stored away to use later. He just received whatever was given, and waited. So Riven talked, not about anything important, not at first. He talked about the compound, about the way the upper block always smelled like mildew after rain, about a supply argument he'd had with Caius that morning that had lasted too long and resolved nothing. He talked the way people talk when they're not trying to communicate, just filling space because the silence has gotten too loud. The Omega listened. That was the thing, he actually listened. Not the performative listening people did when they were waiting for their turn to speak. Real listening. The kind that showed up in the way his eyes tracked, the way his head tilted slightly at certain words, the way he'd pause his eating for a moment when something Riven said surprised him. It was the most heard Riven had felt in a long time. That thought arrived without warning and he pushed it aside. By the end of the first week, the visits were twice a day. By the second week, Riven had moved the floor time into something closer to an hour. He'd lean against the wall, the Omega across from him, both of them in the dim quiet of that cell, while the rest of the compound moved through its noise outside. He felt calmer in here than anywhere else. That should have alarmed him. Didn't. On a Thursday afternoon, midway through a sentence about nothing in particular, the Omega shifted slightly forward, barely, just a degree, and reached out with two fingers and lightly touched the edge of Riven's sleeve. Not grabbing, not pulling. A touch so careful it could have been accidental, except it wasn't. Riven stopped talking. The Omega's hand stayed there for just a moment. Then he pulled back, settled into his previous position, and looked down at the space between them like nothing had happened. But his expression had changed. Not open, not warm, just different. The careful, measured distance that usually sat across his features had shifted by something small and hard to name. Riven looked at where the touch had landed. And the thing that moved through him wasn't confusion. It was the opposite of confusion. A sudden, sharp sense that something had just been confirmed that he hadn't known he was waiting on. That wasn't the touch of someone afraid. That wasn't even the touch of someone grateful. That was the touch of someone who already knew him. And the question that arrived in Riven's chest right then wasn't who is this person. It was, how long have I already known him? Zaire Calloway laughed too easily. That was the thing Riven kept coming back to, the laugh. Not the sound of it, not even the timing. The ease. The way it arrived before it was earned, smooth and practiced, like a reflex that had been trained so long it looked natural. Riven had known Zaire for 2 years. He knew the laugh. He'd never questioned it before. He was questioning everything now. They were in the upper sitting room of the compound. Zaire stretched across the far end of the couch. One ankle crossed over the other, telling Caius some story about a supplier out of the West District who tried to reroute product through a front laundry chain. Caius was half listening. Zion was checking his phone. The room was relaxed in the way rooms only get when everyone in them believes they're safe. Riven sat in the corner chair and said nothing. He'd been doing a lot of that lately. Watching. Zaire was good. He had to admit that. The kind of good that came from years of careful maintenance. Always present enough to seem invested. Always useful enough to avoid suspicion. Always warm enough that questioning him felt like ingratitude. He'd been woven into their circle slowly, over time, the way things get woven in when someone is patient and knows exactly what they're doing. Riven picked up his glass and didn't drink from it. He was watching Zaire's hands. 3 times now. 3 separate conversations over the past 4 days. Someone had mentioned the night of the arrest. Casual mentions. Background noise. And each time something happened to Zaire's hands. Not a flinch. Not a tremor. Just when something unusual happens inside a closed operation, the people close to that operation ask questions. It's natural. It's expected. The arrest had been clean but fast. The Omega's presence near the estate had been unusual, and anyone with genuine curiosity or genuine concern would have looped back at least once. Even casually. Zaire hadn't mentioned it once. Not on the day of the arrest. Not in the 2 weeks since. Power expects people to ask about threats. When someone in the room doesn't, that's its own kind of answer. Riven set his glass down. Across the room, Zaire finished his story. Caius laughed. Zion looked up from his phone for half a second and nodded. Then Zaire turned his head and caught Riven watching him. He smiled. Warm. Easy. Familiar. Riven smiled back. And behind his eyes he kept very, very still. Because the one question he hadn't been able to shake since he'd found that redacted file, the question that had been sitting in the back of his throat like something he couldn't swallow, was this. Zaire had been the one who first flagged the Omega. He'd sent the alert to their security team personally. And now, sitting in this room, watching that practiced smile hold steady across a face he'd trusted for 2 years, Riven needed to see the original security footage. Not the clip they'd been given. The original. The full timestamp. The unedited run. Because somewhere between what Zaire had reported and what Riven had found in that file, something had been removed. And he needed to know what it was before anyone in this room figured out he was looking. The footage was 43 seconds. That was it. 43 seconds of the Omega standing near the east perimeter gate of the Calloway estate. Still, not moving, just standing, before the clip cut off. That was all the security team had been shown. Riven found the rest at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, on a backup server drive that hadn't been wiped because no one had remembered it existed. Mackay hadn't pulled it. Riven had gone in himself, alone, with a drive key and a flashlight and the kind of focus that only comes when a person already suspects the answer and needs to see it confirmed with their own eyes. He plugged in the drive. The file was timestamped 40 minutes before the clip they'd been shown. 40 minutes earlier. He pressed play. And the room he was standing in got very quiet. The footage was exterior, wide-angle, east perimeter, same gate, same timestamp overlay, but earlier. And what it showed wasn't the Omega standing near a gate. It showed a black SUV, backed up to the gate with its hazard lights off. 2 figures getting out of the passenger side. And then, a third figure, smaller, pulled from the back seat. Not walking. Dragged. Heels scraping the gravel, head down, arms slack. Dropped near the gate wall. Left there. The SUV pulled away. The Omega didn't move for 6 minutes. Unconscious. Then he started to come around. Slow, disoriented. One hand pressing against the ground, trying to orient himself. He made it to a sitting position before the estate's own security team arrived and surrounded him. That was what the arrest report called suspicious loitering. Riven stopped the footage. He rewound it. Watched the SUV pull up again. Watched those 2 figures drag a body out of the back seat and leave it at a gate wall like a bag of something unwanted. He watched it 4 times. Then he sat back in the chair and stared at the frozen frame. The SUV caught mid-exit, license plate deliberately angled away from the camera. Deliberate. Someone had known where that camera was pointed. Someone who had access to the estate's security layout. Someone who had been inside that estate many times before. The breath Riven let out was slow and controlled. He didn't feel rage yet. He was past the point where rage came fast, that had burned out of him in his mid-20s, replaced by something colder and more useful. What he felt right now was a kind of stillness. A dense, heavy stillness that settled behind his sternum and didn't move. He ejected the drive, closed the server panel, sat in the dark for a moment. He knew the SUV. He didn't have the plate, they'd made sure of that. But he knew the body shape, the window tint, the specific way the rear left corner sat slightly lower than the right because of a suspension issue that had never been fully corrected. He'd ridden in that vehicle. Twice. It was registered under a shell company Zaire used for West District runs when he didn't want movement logged under his personal accounts. That was the confirmation. Not the suspicion. The confirmation. The Omega hadn't been near that estate because he was a threat. He'd been put there by one. Riven stood up. The cold stillness in his chest shifted, just slightly, just enough, into something with weight and direction. He walked back toward the cell block. Not running. Not hesitating. Just moving, steady and certain. Toward a door he now understood he should have questioned the very first night. The guards weren't there. Riven had made sure of that. A rerouted shift schedule, 2 reassignments, 1 fabricated supply check on the East Corridor. 15 minutes of clear access. He didn't need more than that. He came in through the side entrance, the one that bypassed the main security log, and walked the length of the block to the last cell without turning on the overhead lights. He used the key he'd had copied 3 days ago, quietly without telling anyone, and unlocked the door. The Omega was awake. Of course he was. He was sitting in the same position he always sat in. Back against the wall, legs out, hands loose, but his eyes were already on the door when Riven pushed it open. Like he'd heard the footsteps and counted them down and knew exactly who it would be. Riven crossed the cell and crouched in front of him. He pulled the restraint key from his jacket pocket. The Omega looked at it, then looked at Riven. Something passed across his face. Not relief, not surprise. Something that was harder to name. A kind of arrival. Like this moment had been sitting at the end of a long road and he'd been walking toward it the whole time. Riven unlocked the right wrist first. Then the left. Then both ankles. The Omega didn't move. Didn't stand. Didn't shift toward the door. Didn't do anything that looked like escape or urgency or the desperate grab for freedom that Riven had half expected. He just sat there, wrists now free, and breathed. "You could go," Riven said quietly. No response, obviously. But he didn't move toward the door. Riven sat back on his heels and looked at him. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself do in the first days, when keeping clinical distance felt necessary and important and like the right call. This Omega was young. Younger than the file suggested. There were things in his face that only came from specific kinds of hard experience. A controlled stillness, an economy of expression, the absence of the soft reactiveness that most people never lose. But underneath all that, there was something unguarded in the way he was sitting right now, free for the first time in weeks, not running. Just staying. Just being here. Riven didn't understand it. Then the Omega reached up with his left hand. Slowly, like he wanted to make sure Riven could see exactly what he was doing, and pulled the sleeve back from his wrist. The skin there was layered. Old marks, some healed clean, some not. The kind of history that doesn't erase itself. And there, below the older scars, sitting against the inside of the wrist where the skin was thinnest, a mark. Not a tattoo. Not a brand. A birthmark. Small. Specific. A shape that Riven had spent his whole life glancing at on his own skin without ever knowing what it meant. Because no one had ever told him, and he'd never thought to ask. 3 points. Curved inward. like a closed eye, like a signal. Riven's hand moved before he decided to move it. He pushed up his own left sleeve, right there in the low light of that cell, and held his wrist next to the Omega's. The marks were identical. The air went out of the room. Not a sound. Not a word. Just everything that had been accumulating for weeks, all of it, landing at once in a single moment of total, irreversible recognition. Riven pulled his sleeve back down. He stood up, stepped back, looked at the Omega, who was watching him with that same calm, patient, unbothered expression. And now Riven understood what it actually was. It wasn't distance. It wasn't checked emotion. It was the look of someone who already knew the answer to the question the other person was only just beginning to ask. Riven opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out, because there were no words for what he'd just understood. Not in any language he had, and the Omega seemed to know that too because he just sat there, sleeve still pushed back, mark still visible, and waited. His name was Cashin. Riven found that in the sealed file, the full version, not the redacted copy. It took him another day to get into it, and when he did, he sat with it for a long time before he read past the first page. Cashin Devereaux. Reported missing at age 4. Case filed by a social worker in a district that no longer existed under that name. The file had been bounced between 3 different jurisdictions over a 2-year period before landing in the hands of an oversight body that had since been dissolved. In other words, buried. Not lost. Buried. There was a difference. Lost things disappeared because of neglect. Buried things disappeared because someone dug a hole and put them there on purpose. The bloodline connection was in the 3rd section of the file. Riven read it once, set it down, walked to the window, stood there for a while, and then went back and read it again. Cashin was not a distant relation, not a cousin twice removed, not an old family connection that had faded into technical relevance. He was their brother. Full blood. Same line. Born 2 years after the triplets, from the same mother, a woman whose name had been removed from every record associated with the Cade family before any of them were old enough to ask questions. Someone had taken him, not randomly, not out of desperation, as leverage. The file suggested, in the careful, hedged language of bureaucratic documentation, that Cashin's removal had been arranged by someone with access to the Cade family's private affairs. Someone close enough to know the timing. Close enough to know the mother's situation. Close enough to know that 3 young alphas raised without knowledge of a 4th sibling would never think to look. Riven closed the file. He thought about Zaire. 2 years. That was how long Zaire had been in their circle. 2 years of access, of presence, of proximity to their operations, their finances, their private estate security layouts. 2 years of knowing exactly where Cashin was. And instead of saying a word, instead of doing anything with that knowledge, Zaire had waited until the right moment and used Cashin as a planted threat. A body near an estate. A setup designed to produce exactly one outcome. An innocent person disappeared inside a Cade holding cell, with no trail, no record, and no one asking questions. Because Zaire had known they wouldn't ask. He built that trust precisely so they wouldn't. Riven sat with all of that for a long time. Then he went to the cell. Cashin was sitting up when he came in. Not against the wall this time, but cross-legged in the center of the room, like he'd decided the floor was his and the space was his and the terms of this place had changed even if the physical walls hadn't. Riven sat down across from him. He didn't have the file. He didn't need it. Cashin, he said. First time he'd used the name out loud. The Omega, his brother, looked up. And for the first time since Riven had walked into this cell weeks ago, something shifted in Cashin's face that wasn't controlled, wasn't measured, just there. Raw and there for exactly 1 second before it was pulled back under. But Riven saw it. He saw it. I know what happened, Riven said. I know where you came from. I know what was taken. Cashin held his gaze. I know it was too long, Riven said. All of it. A pause. I'm going to fix it. Cashin didn't nod. Didn't respond with the kind of gratitude that would have made this easier to sit with. He just looked at Riven. Steadily, clearly, without a single thing in his expression that looked like relief. What was there instead was something that Riven didn't fully understand until much later. It looked like patience. Old, deep, deliberate patience. Like someone who had already survived the worst part of the story and was now waiting, calmly, without urgency, to see how the people around him would handle the truth. And in that look, quiet as it was, there was something else underneath it. Something that asked a question Riven hadn't considered yet. Not what are you going to do about this, but do you actually understand what you've just walked into? He didn't tell his brothers. Not that night. Not the next morning, when Zion came into the kitchen at 6 and made coffee and asked Riven why he looked like he hadn't slept. And Riven said long week, and poured his own cup and stood at the counter and did not say a single word about any of it. Not that afternoon, when Caius dropped a supply report on the table and started talking about rerouting 2 of their East Corridor operations, and Riven sat across from him and nodded in the right places and felt the weight of everything he was holding like a stone pressed flat against the center of his chest. He didn't tell them, because he'd sat with the question all night. He'd gone back and forth across the floor of his room until the sky outside had gone from black to gray to the specific pale nothing of early morning. And he'd come back to the same place every single time. If he walked into that room right now and put everything on the table, the footage, the file, the name, the mark, all of it, Zion's first move would be force. It was always force. Swift, certain, total. He didn't have another gear for betrayal. And Caius would follow Zion. He always did. Which meant Zaire would be handled before the sun went down. And that sounded like justice. It almost was. Except, Zaire hadn't acted alone. The file made that clear. The dissolution of oversight bodies, the jurisdiction bouncing, the scrubbed records, the precise coordination of Cashin's removal. That was not one person's work. That was infrastructure. That was money and planning and multiple points of cooperation over years. If Zaire disappeared tomorrow, the rest of it stayed buried. Every other name stayed clean. Cashin got acknowledged by his brothers in a moment of raw, reactive emotion. And then what? Inserted into a family that had just set something on fire? Into a dynamic none of them were prepared for? Without the full picture. Without knowing who else was connected. Riven had spent his whole life watching fast decisions create slow disasters. He wasn't going to do that here. Not with this. He moved Cashin out of the cell block on a Thursday. Quietly. Off record. Into a private room on the compound's 3rd floor, the one with the window that got morning light, the one that didn't share a wall with any active surveillance equipment. He told the 2 guards he trusted most that the room was occupied for operational reasons. No one asked more than that. He brought food himself. Twice a day. Left books. Physical ones, because he'd noticed during one of his early visits that Cashin's eyes tracked the spines of the manuals stacked in the corner of the block office. Lingered there. Moved on only when he realized he was being watched. He left a small notebook. Pen. The next morning it had been used. 3 pages. Riven didn't read them. Left them turned face down on the table the way he'd found them. And when he came back that evening, Cashin glanced at the notebook and then at Riven with something that looked almost like surprise. Like he hadn't expected the boundary to hold. They developed a rhythm. No plan. Nothing formal. Just, Riven would come in, set down whatever he'd brought, sit across from Cashin and sometimes talk and sometimes not. Cashin would write things sometimes. Hold them up. Short things. Observations, mostly. Once, a question, just 3 words in careful block letters. Do they know? Riven looked at it for a moment. Not yet, he said. Cashin looked at him. Put the notebook down. Didn't push. He understood timing the same way Riven did. Maybe better. He'd been surviving on the right timing his entire life. Knowing when to stay still, when to move, when to wait out the people around him and let events develop into shapes he could actually work with. That was the thing about Cashin that kept arriving in Riven's mind at the wrong moments. He wasn't a victim of this situation. He was the most informed person in it. He knew things. Things he hadn't shown yet, hadn't communicated, hadn't even hinted at. Riven could feel it in the edges of every interaction. The way Cashin listened to certain names with a different quality of attention, the way his eyes moved when the compound structure came up in conversation, the way he'd stop writing and just sit for a moment when Riven mentioned the West District operations. He was holding something back, not out of distrust, out of patience, waiting for the right moment. On the 14th day, Riven came in and found Cashin standing at the window. First time he'd seen him standing voluntarily, first time he'd seen him choose to face something head-on instead of receiving it from a controlled position on the floor. He was looking out at the morning, hands loose at his sides, and he didn't turn around when Riven came in. Riven set the food down, stood behind him. They stayed like that for a while. Then Caius's voice came through the compound intercom. Just a standard announcement. A meeting call, nothing urgent. And Riven watched Cashin's reflection in the window glass. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved, tracked to something outside the window, then back. Then he finally turned around. And he looked at Riven the way he had that very first night in the storm. Direct, clear, carrying information that he was choosing to hold back for reasons Riven still didn't fully understand. He picked up the notebook, wrote something, held it up. For words this time. He's not acting alone. Riven looked at the page, then at Cashin. Who else? Cashin looked at him for a long moment. Then he lowered the notebook and turned back to the window. And outside, somewhere in the lower compound, a door opened and closed. A door that Riven now realized he hadn't heard open, which meant someone had been on that floor. For how long, he didn't know. And Cashin, still facing the window, very slowly pulled the notebook against his chest, like he was protecting something inside it. Like he'd known someone was there before Riven did. And downstairs, at the bottom of a stairwell that connected the third floor to the main compound, a set of footsteps walked away. Unhurried, measured, calm. Justice wasn't going to be a single moment. Riven understood that now. It was going to be a choice made over and over again about when and how and what got protected in the process. He looked at Cashin's reflection in the glass. And Cashin, without turning around, said nothing. But the notebook was still held tight against his chest. And whatever was written inside it hadn't been shown yet. If the story moved something in you, if you felt every silence, every shift, every moment where truth sat one step ahead of the people chasing it, drop a comment and tell us which moment hit you the hardest. This channel exists for stories like this. Stories that don't let go. Stories where justice is slow, loyalty is complicated, and the truth arrives when it's ready, not when it's convenient. Subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Every story we release on this channel is built to stay with you. You don't want to miss what comes next. And you don't want to miss the conversations happening in the comments, where people just like you are sharing what these stories mean to them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And keep watching. The next story is already waiting.